The killer everyone trusted until it was too late. The Ted Bundy story. He was the kind of man people trusted. That was the scariest part. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He wasn't foaming at the mouth. He wasn't some strange loner in a dark coat with heavy breathing and blood-stained hands. Number Ted Bundy wore a smile. He had warm eyes, spoke with clarity, and could shake hands with a police officer one moment, then stalk a woman through a parking garage the next. He was terrifying not because he looked like a monster, but because he didn't. That's how the nightmare began. It was the 1970s. America was changing fast, from the chaos of the Vietnam War to the birth of a new kind of independence among young people. Women were taking control of their lives, moving away from home, getting college degrees, living alone for the first time. And then, one by one, they started disappearing. Young women in Washington State, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, a trail of missing persons that no one could quite connect. Some vanished from their dorms. Others were last seen near libraries. One walked into a parking lot and never came out. There were no fingerprints, no weapon, no screams, just silence. And then emptiness. Meanwhile, Ted Bundy kept smiling. He drove a beige Volkswagen Beetle. He volunteered on political campaigns. He had a girlfriend who loved him, co-workers who respected him, professors who praised him. He even worked at a suicide crisis hotline, talking people down from the edge of death, while secretly feeding on it. The duality was so twisted, so profound, that even when people suspected something was off, they never saw him as dangerous. He was too clean-cut, too intelligent, too normal. But behind that boy-next-door charm, a monster was evolving. Bundy was born in 1946, but he never really knew who he was. He grew up believing his grandparents were his parents, that his mother was his sister. His real father? Unknown. And this early deception planted something deep inside him. A fracture, a hunger, a need to control truth itself, to become the version of reality that no one would question. And he did. He studied psychology. He mimicked people. He taught himself how to behave like the person people expected. He watched carefully, learned how to manipulate faces, tones, body language. He wasn't just pretending. He was performing. Every interaction was a rehearsal for something darker. By the time he reached law school, he was already blending his masks into one terrifying character: the polite killer, the gentleman predator. In 1974, things escalated. Bundy began hunting. He would walk through college campuses, pretending to be injured, arm in a sling, books in hand, struggling near his car. Always the car. He would ask for help, just for a moment. A kind favor. That was the trap. And the moment they leaned in, stepped forward, offered a hand, he would strike. Sometimes with a crowbar, sometimes with just his strength, always with calculation. He would kidnap them, often in broad daylight, then vanish. And by the time anyone realized they were missing, he was already gone, already driving, already planning the next one. Police were baffled, desperate. The killer left no clues, no connection, no motive, just a growing list of missing women and a community drowning in fear. Whispers of a man named Ted started surfacing. A man with a cast, a limp, a soft voice. A few descriptions mentioned the car. But nothing stuck. Because who could believe it was Ted Bundy? By then, he had crossed state lines. He moved freely, killing with a terrifying rhythm. He kept souvenirs, photos, clothing, sometimes body parts. He revisited the crime scenes. He wasn't just killing, he was conquering, playing God, deciding who lived, who died, and how long they'd be remembered. And still, people liked him. Even as the police narrowed in, even as he was arrested in 1975 for a suspicious traffic stop and his car revealed ropes, handcuffs, and a ski mask. He talked his way out of suspicion. They didn't want to believe it. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like someone you'd hire to babysit your kids. It didn't matter that his girlfriend had already gone to police with concerns, that she'd found strange objects in his house, that he'd disappeared for long stretches of time. Her warnings were ignored. Ted was just too convincing, too clever, too safe. That's how he stayed one step ahead, until the bodies started to surface. Skeletal remains were found in remote wooded areas, several in Washington, others in Colorado, all young women, all fitting a type, long brown hair parted down the middle, smart, independent. They didn't run into danger. Danger came to them, and it looked like someone they could trust, even when he was finally arrested again. Even when evidence began to build, Bundy didn't panic. He didn't cry. He didn't confess. Instead, he smiled, flirted, talked circles around investigators. And when he was transferred to jail in Aspen, Colorado, awaiting trial, he escaped. Jumped from a library window during a court recess, broke his ankle, still ran, hid in the mountains for days, stole a car, then got caught again. But even that didn't stop him. Because just months later, back in custody, he escaped again, this time crawling through a hole in the ceiling of his cell, losing 30 pounds to fit. He stacked books under a blanket to make it look like he was asleep, then vanished into the night. The guards didn't notice for 17 hours. By the time they did, he was already on a bus to Chicago. From there, to Atlanta, then to Florida, a fugitive, a ghost, a serial killer, on the loose in a brand new state. And what he did next would be his most violent act yet. But we're not there yet. This is still the beginning. The beginning of a story about how one man weaponized trust, how he turned smiles into lies, kindness into bait, and his own humanity into a deadly disguise. Bundy didn't wear a mask to hide the monster. The mask was the monster. And by the time America realized it, he was already 3 steps ahead. Let's dive into Bundy's Florida killing spree, the Chi Omega attack, his final victim, and how his mask began to crack before a stunned nation. When Ted Bundy slipped through the ceiling of his Colorado jail cell in late 1977, it wasn't just an escape. It was a declaration. He wasn't finished. He wasn't sorry. He was free, and the monster beneath the mask had tasted power again. But this time, he wasn't returning to familiar hunting grounds. He was done hiding in forests and shadows. He wanted something louder, bigger, more brutal. He went to Florida. He arrived in Tallahassee with nothing. No ID, no money, no plan. He stole a car, slept in abandoned buildings, ate off of vending machines. For most people, that would have been a low point. But for Bundy, it was a rebirth. Florida didn't know his name. They didn't know his face. He was invisible again, and he would use that invisibility to commit his most horrifying acts yet. Just a few weeks after arriving, he walked onto the campus of Florida State University, blending in among the students like he belonged there. It was a quiet Saturday night, January 15th, 1978. Inside the Chi Omega sorority house, girls were getting ready for bed. Some had been out at parties. Others were reading, laughing, listening to music. Innocent routines, shattered within minutes. Bundy slipped through an unlocked door sometime after 2:30 a.m. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He moved from room to room like a ghost, carrying a piece of firewood and a belt. What happened next was so fast, so silent, and so savage that to this day, survivors still struggle to explain it. He bludgeoned and strangled 4 women in under 15 minutes. Margaret Bowman was beaten to death in her bed. Lisa Levy was attacked with such force that her injuries were described as inhuman. 2 other women, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were left critically injured. Their skulls fractured, their lives shattered. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The next morning, the news exploded. A killer had stormed a sorority house in the heart of a university. There was no motive, no message, just chaos. Police were stunned by the boldness, by the confidence. It was unlike anything they'd seen. They didn't know yet that this wasn't a one-time spree. It was part of a pattern, a final flaming tale of destruction before the star finally burned out. Bundy didn't stop there. Just hours after the Chi Omega attack, he broke into another apartment just a few blocks away and attacked Cheryl Thomas, a young dancer. He shattered her jaw, damaged her hearing permanently, and then vanished once more. It was like he was feeding off the violence, testing how far he could go before someone finally stopped him. But he wasn't finished. 3 weeks later, on February 9th, 1978, in Lake City, Florida, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from her middle school. She never came home. Her body was found weeks later, discarded in a pig shed. The brutality of her death and the fact that she was so young sent a new wave of panic through Florida. Now it wasn't just college girls. Now no one was safe. Ted was unraveling, but he was still careful enough to stay ahead. He used stolen IDs, changed cars, stayed on the move. But even monsters get sloppy. And on February 15th, while driving a stolen orange Volkswagen Beetle, he was pulled over by Officer David Lee in Pensacola. Bundy fought, ran, tried to flee once more, but this time he was caught. And this time, the mask began to crack. When they brought him in, Bundy still refused to give his name. He acted smug, mysterious. He wanted control. But police were done playing games. His face hit the media, and instantly he was recognized. The name Ted Bundy swept across America like a lightning bolt. All the horror, all the bodies, all the stories suddenly connected. The trial that followed wasn't just about justice. It was a spectacle. It was the first trial in U.S. history to be televised nationally. People tuned in not just to see if he would be convicted. They wanted to see how he would act. Would he finally admit it? Would he cry, beg, break down? Instead, he performed. Bundy insisted on defending himself. He cross-examined witnesses, smiled at the camera, flirted with journalists. He wasn't just on trial for murder. He was staging a twisted version of a courtroom drama, starring himself. And people, disturbingly, were fascinated. Women sent him fan mail. Some came to watch in person, convinced he was innocent. And in the middle of it all, Bundy did the unthinkable. He proposed marriage to Carol Ann Boone while she was on the witness stand, and thanks to a Florida loophole, the exchange was legally binding. They got married right there in front of the jury. It was surreal. But the evidence was too strong. The eyewitness accounts, the teeth marks that matched Bundy's dental impressions, the sorority survivors who described him, the stolen IDs, the fibers, the blood. Piece by piece, the web he built to shield himself fell apart. In 1979, he was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death. In 1980, he received a second death sentence for the murder of Kimberly Leach. But even then, he kept playing games, filing appeals, buying time, doing interviews, feeding on the spotlight. He thought he could outsmart the system, just like he'd outsmarted everyone else. But time was running out, and beneath the confidence, the cracks were widening. His charm was rotting. His eyes, once lively, now looked hollow. He gave strange, erratic interviews. He started confessing, slowly, carefully, trying to delay the inevitable. He told investigators he had murdered 30 women. Some believe the real number is much higher. In his final days, he started blaming pornography, saying it warped his mind. But by then, no one was listening. The world had seen enough. They weren't interested in excuses. They wanted answers and closure. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside the prison gates, a crowd had gathered, cheering, holding signs, celebrating. Some brought fireworks. Others shouted, "Burn, Bundy, burn." For the first time in decades, the mask was gone. And what was left behind wasn't a man. It wasn't a monster either. It was something worse. It was a reflection of how easily trust can be broken and how evil can hide in plain sight. You can't talk about Ted Bundy without talking about manipulation, not just the kind that tricks a stranger into walking toward a car. No, this was deeper, colder, more precise. Ted Bundy didn't just fool his victims, he fooled everyone, the women who loved him, the police who let him walk, the lawyers who underestimated him, and even the media that turned him into a twisted celebrity. That's the part people still can't wrap their heads around. How does a man who sleeps beside a woman, calls her baby, brings her coffee in the morning, then disappear for a few hours and kill a stranger, live with himself? How do you wear two faces for years, knowing one of them is soaked in blood? Psychologists have tried to answer that, but Bundy didn't make it easy. He wasn't just a killer, he was a chameleon, a mirror. Every time someone tried to get close, he became whatever they wanted him to be. If they wanted a gentleman, he opened doors and smiled politely. If they wanted intelligence, he quoted law books. If they needed sympathy, he shed crocodile tears. But behind all that charm was a man with zero empathy. Bundy didn't feel guilt. He felt inconvenience. He said what needed to be said, not because he meant it, but because it worked. That's why he was so dangerous, not because of what he did with his hands, but what he could do with his words. That's why even after dozens of deaths, people still doubted he was capable. His girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, lived with him for 5 years. She suspected. She found knives, women's clothing, plaster casts, but each time, he made her question herself. He made her feel guilty for asking. That was his real weapon, psychological warfare. But if you want to understand where it all began, you have to go further back, before the blood, before the fame, back to when he was just a boy, living in a house built on a lie. Ted Bundy was born in 1946 in a Vermont home for unwed mothers. His birth certificate listed his father as unknown. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, took him to Philadelphia and raised him as her brother, while her parents pretended to be his mom and dad. He grew up thinking his mother was his sister, a twisted family secret that haunted him for years. That kind of deception doesn't just confuse a child, it fractures them, splits their identity. Ted once described discovering the truth as shattering. Some experts believe that's where the dual personality began. The desire to control reality, to manipulate what people believed, and eventually to punish women who reminded him of that early betrayal. As a teenager, he was already showing signs. He spied on neighbors, stalked girls, became obsessed with violent stories and detective novels. But outwardly, he looked normal, polite, soft-spoken. He was smart, but in a cunning way, not an academic one. He was always watching, learning what worked, mimicking social behaviors like a performer rehearsing a role. In college, he carefully constructed a version of himself: clean clothes, good posture, conservative haircut. He volunteered for political campaigns and posed for photos with governors. He acted like he belonged in the spotlight. But beneath the surface, something was brewing. He dated a woman named Stephanie Brooks, wealthy, confident, the kind of girl who made him feel like he mattered. But when she broke up with him, saying he lacked direction, something snapped. He later said her rejection was the moment that cut the deepest. Years later, after crafting a successful image, Ted got back together with her, just to dump her as revenge. He didn't want love, he wanted control, and that became the theme of his life. Control. His victims weren't chosen at random. He hunted women who looked like Stephanie, long brown hair, parted down the middle, intelligent. And he didn't just want to end their lives. He wanted to own them. That's why he revisited crime scenes. That's why he arranged their bodies, spoke to them after death, sometimes kept pieces of them. He wasn't killing people, he was collecting them. That's where his psychology turns truly monstrous. Bundy didn't operate like a man with urges he couldn't control. He operated like someone who enjoyed having power over other people's reality. His murders weren't frenzied. They were planned, clean, executed with surgical precision. He buried evidence, moved bodies, covered his tracks. Even the way he spoke in interviews, calm, measured, was designed to make you doubt everything you'd heard. Because that's what he loved most, doubt. If you doubted the evidence, he could breathe a little longer. If you doubted your instincts, he could kill again. If you doubted your memory, he could keep his secrets. Ted Bundy didn't just escape prison walls. He escaped the mental prisons of everyone around him. Even when he was finally captured, even when the evidence was overwhelming, Bundy still believed he could out-talk death. He took control of his own defense in court, not because he trusted the system, but because he trusted himself. He thought he was smarter than the lawyers, smarter than the cops, smarter than the judge. And for a while, he was. That courtroom became his theater. He posed for photos, bantered with the judge, cross-examined witnesses with a calm, confident tone. And when it all became too real, when the sentence was read, he didn't break down. He winked, but the mind behind the smile was crumbling. During his final years on death row, Bundy granted interviews to psychologists and FBI agents. Slowly, the cracks in his persona began to widen. He spoke about himself in the third person. He hinted at crimes no one had linked him to. He described strangling women with pantyhose like he was discussing the weather. And then, there were his final confessions. Just before his execution, Bundy started talking. Not out of guilt, but desperation. He confessed to more than 30 murders. Said he had a compulsion, blamed pornography, blamed alcohol, blamed childhood confusion. But none of it felt like remorse. It felt like stalling, bargaining, a final attempt to control the narrative one last time. But the truth had already escaped, and the world was no longer fooled. Because in the end, Ted Bundy didn't just teach us about murder. He taught us about trust, about how easy it is to believe the wrong person when they say the right thing. He taught us that evil doesn't always scream in your face. Sometimes it holds the door open. Ted Bundy didn't just commit murder. He changed America. Before him, serial killers were shadows, mysterious names in newspapers. But Bundy? He had a face, a voice, a smile. And that made him terrifying in a whole new way. He didn't just kill people. He broke the American image of what a killer was supposed to be. He wasn't a stranger hiding in an alley. He was the guy you dated, the guy who helped you carry groceries, the guy who told jokes, opened doors, and made you feel safe. That's what shook the country the most. And that's why the obsession began. When Bundy was finally caught in Florida, the media had no idea what they were walking into. At first, it was just another murder case. But then details started surfacing. This wasn't a one-time killer. This was a cross-country nightmare, stretching from Washington to Utah to Colorado, all the way to Florida. One man, dozens of victims, multiple escapes, charisma, intelligence, smiles. Suddenly, every journalist in America wanted a piece of him. And Bundy? He loved it. He wasn't hiding anymore. In fact, he performed. He spoke clearly in interviews, corrected reporters, smirked when asked about the victims, wore suits, walked tall in the courtroom like it was his stage. There were moments during his Florida trial where people forgot what he was even accused of. He had that effect. He made people doubt, and women still adored him. That part made headlines, too. The phenomenon of Bundy groupies. Young women lined up outside the courtroom, holding signs, passing notes, sending love letters. They said things like, "He couldn't have done it. He's too handsome." One woman even said, "I wish he'd kidnap me." It was horrifying, but it was real. And it forced America to ask a question it had never asked before. Why are we attracted to danger? Some experts called it hybristophilia, a condition where people feel sexually attracted to those who commit violent crimes. But in Bundy's case, it went deeper. He symbolized the ultimate contradiction, a man who looked like a hero but lived like a demon. He was the prince in the fairy tale, with blood on his hands. and America was addicted to the shock of it. The trial itself felt like a twisted TV show. It was the first nationally televised murder trial in U.S. history. People didn't just read about it. They watched it live. They saw Bundy smirk, flirt, argue, defend himself. They watched as he proposed to Carol Ann Boone, a woman who believed in his innocence so deeply, she married him right there, on the witness stand. It felt surreal, but it was real. And every day, millions of people tuned in, not because they wanted justice, but because they couldn't look away. Bundy had turned murder into theater. But behind all the theatrics was a brutal truth. The justice system had failed over and over. This man had been arrested, escaped, been reported, and yet he kept getting away. Why? Because he didn't fit the stereotype. Because cops, judges, even the public, they looked at him and saw a man who couldn't possibly do something that evil. And that's exactly what he counted on. After his execution, some FBI agents admitted that if Bundy had never gone to Florida, he might never have been caught. The Florida rampage was sloppy, brutal. It was rage-driven, unlike his earlier calculated murders. That break in pattern, that escalation, is what finally exposed him. Otherwise, he could have stayed on the run, kept killing, for years. That revelation left the country uneasy. It wasn't just about what he had done. It was about how close he came to getting away with all of it. And what haunted people most was that he didn't look like a killer. That became the core of the conversation in the years that followed. The story of Ted Bundy became a cautionary tale. For women, it was a warning that politeness isn't always safe, that danger doesn't always wear a mask. For law enforcement, it was a wake-up call that gut instinct and appearances are not enough. For the justice system, it was a reminder that you cannot underestimate someone just because they're articulate and educated. And for psychologists, Bundy became a case study. He wasn't insane. He wasn't out of control. He didn't hear voices. What he did, he chose to do. Calmly, repeatedly. He didn't just kill. He relished the process, every detail, every manipulation, every moment of power. He called it the entity, a force he claimed lived inside him, pushing him toward darkness. But the truth? The darkness was him, entirely him. Even the way he confessed was strategic. He only opened up when it benefited him. He started talking just days before his execution, hoping to stall it. He offered little bits, danced around the details, controlled the narrative until the end. He said he killed over 30 women, but many believe that number is much higher. Some say 50, others believe even 100, and we may never know. Because Ted Bundy was a master of erasing footprints. He destroyed evidence, spread his crimes across states, buried bodies in forests so remote many were never found. What he left behind was confusion, trauma, and the terrifying knowledge that a man like him could exist. Bundy didn't invent evil, but he modernized it. He brought it into the suburbs, into classrooms, onto TV screens. He showed that a killer could wear khakis and smile for the camera. He shattered the idea that monsters were easy to spot. And in doing so, he changed the way America saw danger forever. His case led to sweeping reforms, from new laws about evidence sharing between states to the creation of behavioral analysis units within the FBI. He inspired books, documentaries, films. His face still haunts posters. His name still trends online, but the most chilling part? His story still works, because today, decades later, people still fall for charm, still mistake confidence for character, still ignore red flags when the packaging looks right. That was Bundy's legacy, not just the pain he left behind, but the mirror he held up to all of us. A mirror that asked, how many more monsters have we trusted? When the switch was pulled on January 24, 1989, and the current surged through Ted Bundy's body in Florida State Prison's electric chair, it didn't just end a man. It ended a performance, A 20-year masquerade that left dozens of families shattered, law enforcement humbled, and an entire nation permanently more suspicious of kindness. But even in death, Ted Bundy's story was not over. Because the true terror of Bundy was never just about what he did, it was about how many people he fooled while he was doing it. How easily he wore the skin of a gentleman, how many doors opened for him, how many warnings were dismissed because of a smile. And that smile lives on. To this day, Bundy's crimes are studied in criminology classes across the world, not for their gore, but for their method. He didn't need a gun or an army. He didn't hack computers or pull off heists. He simply walked through the world unnoticed, invisible in plain sight, because he understood human psychology better than anyone wanted to admit. He knew that people are trained to trust appearances, that we confuse good looks with goodness, that a clean suit erases suspicion, that confidence can mute even our loudest instincts. Ted Bundy was a walking experiment, and we failed the test. The media turned him into a myth, a monster, a legend. But ask any victim's family and they'll tell you he was no legend. He was a man who made choices, who calculated every lie, who planned every kill. The monster label can almost be a comfort, something inhuman, something different from us. But Bundy wasn't different. That's what made him dangerous. He was just like us. He just chose evil, and he chose it repeatedly. In his final interviews, Bundy tried to redirect the story. Blamed pornography, childhood lies, temptation, the so-called entity inside him. But experts who reviewed his statements found them cold and mechanical. He wasn't looking for truth. He was buying time. He confessed only when there was something in it for him, not remorse, leverage. In fact, his last words before execution were not an apology to victims. They were a soft-spoken, "Give my love to my family and friends." That's how far removed he was from the destruction he caused. Not one name, not one sorry. Just a final attempt to stay in control. And yet, the world keeps talking about him. Netflix, podcasts, books, fan theories. What if he hadn't been caught in Florida? What if he had gotten that appeal? What if the real number of victims is even higher? All these questions, and few focus on the women he murdered. Because Bundy didn't just manipulate individuals, he manipulated history. He became the headline, the face, the soundbite. But the women he killed, so many are still nameless to the general public. Janice Ott, Denise Naslund, Susan Rancourt, Brenda Ball, Laura Amy, Nancy Wilcox, dozens more. They're remembered in fragments, footnotes, in the background of Bundy's spotlight. That's one of the cruelties that still haunts the survivors. He took their names, not just their lives. And those who lived? They never left that night behind. Kathy Kleiner, one of the Chi Omega survivors, still wakes up with the memory of Bundy's silhouette in her bedroom. She was 20 years old when he attacked her. He broke her jaw, fractured her face. She survived. But the damage never healed fully. Not the physical scars, not the memory of blood on her pillow. What Bundy left behind wasn't just a legacy of fear. It was a legacy of mistrust. After his case, America changed. Doors that once stayed open were locked. Hitchhiking vanished. Police departments started working together across state lines. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, once a small project, gained national importance. Profiling killers became a science because Bundy proved that they weren't monsters hiding under bridges. They were living next door. Bundy also forced Americans to ask an uncomfortable question. Can someone do everything right on the outside and still be evil inside? The answer was yes. He had a college degree. He volunteered. He had a girlfriend. He hugged children. People said he was funny, sweet, even gentle. And none of that stopped him from bludgeoning a child to death. That contradiction shook the public's belief in what safety really meant. And it opened the door to new discussions. Women started speaking more boldly about listening to gut feelings, about not being afraid to say no, to walk away, to trust instincts even when the man is smiling. The phrase Bundy-like became shorthand for men who used charm as a weapon. It became a cultural reference point, the reminder that kindness can be faked and that evil can dress itself in whatever costume it likes. But maybe the most terrifying thing Bundy revealed is that we still want to believe in the mask. Even now, decades later, people ask, how could someone like him do those things? The truth is, he didn't do them despite his charm. He did them because of it. It was his tool, his camouflage. Without it, he was just another creep with a crowbar. But with it, he was unstoppable. Until Florida. He made it that far because people doubted themselves, because they second-guessed their suspicions, because his image didn't match their idea of danger. And in that gap, between instinct and doubt, he thrived. So what do we learn from Ted Bundy? Not just about crime, not just about psychology, but about ourselves. We learn that evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it says please and thank you. Sometimes it holds the door open and offers to carry your groceries. Evil doesn't always come at you with red flags. Sometimes it wears a suit and a scholarship. We learn that trusting your gut is not rude, it's survival. We learn that appearances are not proof. We learn that no one is too nice to be dangerous. And we learn that justice isn't always quick, or clean, or clear. It took years to catch Bundy. 2 escapes, dozens of interviews. He made fools of people who should have known better. And when he finally paid for what he did, the families of his victims didn't celebrate. They grieved. Because even with justice served, the pain didn't end. It never does. And so the story of Ted Bundy, as horrifying as it is not just a story about him. It's about us, about how we see others, about how easily we hand over trust, about the blind spots we still have. He isn't the only one of his kind. He won't be the last. But we don't have to fall for the act again. Because now we know what it looks like. Now we understand the game. Now we know that evil doesn't always knock loudly. Sometimes it walks in the front door with a smile. So the next time someone tells you, "He seems like such a nice guy," take a breath. Remember the name. Remember the eyes. Remember the voice that convinced a nation. And ask yourself, what's behind the smile? Thank you for watching. If this story shocked you, if it made you rethink trust, appearance, or even yourself, then subscribe for more untold stories and chilling truths from history. This is Uncle Luke Tells, and we don't just tell stories. We reveal what the world tried to forget.